It began as a weekend fling with an old flame.
She said we had an affair. Yes, it was once. That was it.
But when the affair ended, the stalking began.
You have this woman that is causing all these problems.
Acts of vandalism, letters and harassments.
We're all terrified of her. She's unstable. She could do anything.
And when the harassment turned to violence,
the first thing I noticed was the bullet hole.
Police were soon on the stalker's trail.
It's really his own fatal attraction situation.
But this time, the story would be updated with a 21st century twist.
When you use a computer, it leaves tracks or electronic fingerprints behind.
At 4 in the afternoon on June 10, 2007, 42-year-old Ann Stout walked into the bedroom of her home outside the small town of Darby, Montana. She was looking for her husband, Bill, and she found him.
She finds Bill laying on the bed on his side. There's blood.
Ann immediately dialed 911.
I just got home, and there's something wrong with my husband. There's blood, and his eyes are all bruised, and he's cold.
Bill Stout was dead, killed by a single gunshot to the head. But whose finger had been on the trigger? Not Bill's, judging by the crime scene. The gun that had fired the fatal bullet wasn't clutched in his cold hand, or even in his bedroom.
That's a big concern, that you have a gunshot injury and you don't have a firearm in the area.
But who would want to murder Bill Stout? Questioned at a neighbor's house, his widow quickly gave police a possible suspect.
Her name is Barbara Miller.
Ann told police that Bill had had a brief fling with Barbara, and that Barbara had not been at all pleased when Bill broke it off.
Ann claimed Barbara Miller had been sending emails, unsolicited, threatening emails to Ann and Ann's children.
Ann and Bill's sons also told investigators about the other woman.
They told me that Barbara Miller could be a suspect.
She was sending all those emails to all me, my brother, my mom, my dad. It was really creepy, you know. Just, I don't know, it freaked me out.
And according to one of his sons, Bill Stout had been freaked out too.
He told me that his dad was extremely concerned because a pistol of his had recently gone missing.
Had Bill's jilted lover killed him with his own gun? Barely an hour into the investigation, the signs were already pointing the detectives in that direction.
We had a viable suspect right off the bat.
But the deeper they dug, the more detectives would find themselves asking, was something about this Hollywood-style fatal attraction a little too scripted? "20-year-old single mom Ann Hussein first caught Bill Stout's eye when she took his breakfast order at a Prunedale, California cafe in the early 1980s.
I think he was really impressed with Anna because she's really outgoing, very witty, you know, she always has a laugh for you.
In July of 1985, the hard-working builder took on 2 new jobs, husband and father to Ann's 3-year-old son, Ben.
Bill not only loved my sister and took her in, but also took Ben as his own child.
The family continued to grow. Ann gave birth to son Noah in 1988 and Matthew 2 years later. In 1995, Bill decided to relocate the family to Montana.
Bill was just in the thought of, hey, that'd be great if I could just, get away from this crazy California life, get up there in the wild, live out in the middle of nowhere.
The family bought 20 acres outside the small town of Darby and started building their dream home, complete with horses in the pasture and a Harley in the garage.
Bill was your stereotypical Western Montana man, tough, work with his hands.
My dad liked to hunt. Definitely in the summers we'd go fishing sometimes.
Ann, meanwhile, made sure her sons excelled in school.
She knew all my teachers, knew all my friends.
The Stouts seemed to have it all. 3 growing boys, a picturesque home, and a loving marriage.
They were in love. I mean, it was embarrassing to me that my parents would be touchy-feely.
But just after New Year's in 2000, the family's happiness was shattered by the death of Ann's eldest son, Ben.
He had committed suicide after he finished his first semester of college at the University of Montana.
Ann and Bill seemed helpless to comfort each other.
They grieved in different ways. Bill didn't talk about it, and Anna needed to talk about it.
She had to undergo counseling and she had medication.
The combination of counseling, medication, and time eventually dulled Ann's pain. But the tragedy took a tremendous toll on Ann and Bill's marriage.
After that year, there was, a lot more sniping going on. And I think everyone's always looking for someone to blame.
It created maybe a lack of communication between the two of them.
And in May of 2005, Ann discovered just how serious the lack of communication in her marriage had become.
She gets a phone call from a woman who doesn't identify herself but advises Ann that Bill is having an affair.
She confronted him. At first he denied it. After a while, I guess he did admit it.
It had all begun barely a month before, when Bill traveled to Arkansas to attend an old friend's wedding alone. At the wedding, Bill had been reunited with another guest, a woman named Barbara Miller.
She was a romantic interest in Bill's youth. I believe they were in high school, maybe a first love.
I had not seen him since I broke up with him, 30-some years prior.
Bill and Barbara had spent the whole weekend getting reacquainted.
They spend the weekend together in his motel room.
We talked about how we missed each other and we wished that things had been different and regrets, but that we couldn't go back, but we could start fresh.
But what about his wife? Bill had told Barbara that his marriage had been in trouble for years.
He did say that they were separated. I was led to believe that he'd already talked to a lawyer.
After Bill returned to Montana, he and Barbara had kept in touch.
Bill had given her an address for a post office box in Hamilton that Ann Stout knew nothing about.
They had even made plans for a romantic getaway at the end of May.
Bill and I had planned a trip for me to come up there to Montana. He sent me some tickets, and I was going to go on a vacation there.
But when Ann confronted Bill about the affair, he agreed to end it.
He said he would no longer see her again.
Bill canceled Barbara's plane tickets. Then he sent her an email ending the month-long relationship.
It was just very blunt, just, like a Dear John letter, if you will. Just, I made a mistake.
As far as Bill was concerned, the affair was over. But would Barbara agree? Her initial response to Bill's email certainly didn't sound like it.
I thought, I'll show you. So I emailed him and I said, think again, I'm gonna be there.
More emails and letters followed.
He starts receiving letters threatening to come to Montana and accuse him and pull out this affair in public.
Bill's friends and family also started receiving strange emails from someone calling themselves Freak of Arc.
I had received an email. It had said that Bill was keeping secrets and Ann will be out of the picture soon.
I showed it to Bill, and he just shook his head. He says, Mark, this is a crazy woman.
But was Barbara crazy enough to follow through on her threat to come to Montana?
His wife had received some calls from Barbara, or a person that she believed was Barbara. The calls came from a local Hamilton, Montana phone number.
He becomes nervous and anxious and worried.
Ann did more than worry. She contacted Barbara's employer about the harassment.
She had complained that I was using my work computer to contact her family and threaten them.
Barbara denied the accusation, and when the threatening emails continued to arrive from Freak of Arc, Bill Stout went to the Ravalli County Sheriff on August 12, 2005.
He made a report to me about some possible stalking activity from an ex-girlfriend, Barbara Miller.
Bill would soon have even more to report. Early the next morning, he discovered his truck had been vandalized in the driveway.
I could hear my parents yelling about it, and and my mom saying, "Put the gun away." That's how frightened my dad was. There's a 911 call.
My car just got egged. I filed a complaint against somebody today, and they just egged my truck.
He believed that Barbara Miller was responsible for that. The deputies responded and they were not able to find anyone in the area.
Sheriff's deputies wrote up a report, but the incident wasn't enough to trigger a full-blown investigation. Still, over the next year, the emails, phone calls, and the occasional act of vandalism continued off and on.
There's really this paranoia in the house. We're under the impression that she's unstable, that she could do anything.
In spite of the frightening fallout from the affair, Ann and Bill seemed determined to get their marriage back on track.
We were in Montana a year after the affair, and it was a great time, and I felt they made it back. They're happy again, and they were.
But their happiness wasn't destined to last long. On Saturday, June 9th, 2007, Ann and Bill Stout settled in for a quiet evening at home. Ann grilled steaks for Matthew and Bill. Matthew left to hang out with friends at a bonfire after dinner, and with son Noah out of town, Ann and Bill had the house to themselves.
She and Bill watch a movie, they then make love.
Early the next morning, Ann and Matthew left Bill in bed while they went to Missoula to run errands.
They get back at the house at 4. She and Matthew bring the groceries into the house, and she's yelling around for Bill to come help her.
When he didn't answer, Ann went into their bedroom.
She opens the door of the bedroom. She finds Bill laying on the bed, on his side. There's blood.
Moments later, the Ravalli County 911 Center received a frantic phone call.
My name is Stout, and I just got home, and there's something wrong with my husband. There's blood, and his eyes are all bruised, and he's cold.
Coming up, after months of thefts, threats, and vandalism, had Bill's stalker finally struck.
Her involvement in this case was something that we started working on immediately.
At around 4:30 on the afternoon of June 10th, 2007, the Ravalli County, Montana 911 Center received a frantic call from the home of Ann and Bill Stout. Ann, as she explained to the dispatcher, had just discovered her husband lying in a pool of blood.
Is he conscious? No, I think yes. He's not breathing anything.
Within minutes, an ambulance arrived at the home.
The body was laying on the bed, facing away with a pillow partially covering the head.
But they were too late. Much too late.
They don't run a strip on him. They don't put any kind of sensors on him. They can see that he's obviously dead.
And the detectives quickly discovered the cause of death.
Well, the first thing I noticed was the bullet hole in his head.
There was a very obvious wound to the head that was possibly a suicide.
7 years after his adopted son's suicide, had Bill Stout also taken his own life?
I could see one hand above the covers. The gun was nowhere around that hand. The other hand was under the covers. After I documented the scene as I found it, I checked that hand and the gun wasn't there.
Which immediately suggested one thing to the police.
There was no firearm present. So that was a giant concern for us in that it might not be a suicide.
Had Bill Stout been murdered? The lack of a gun near the body, along with the 9mm shell casing police found under the pillow, certainly pointed to a homicide.
A dead person can't hide a gun.
But if Bill hadn't shot himself, whose finger had been on the trigger? That evening, while police secured the crime scene, Detective Perry Johnson interviewed Ann at a neighbor's house.
She's quite composed. She's able to talk. She's not hysterical. She's not weeping or sobbing or any of that.
Did Bill have any problems with anyone?
No, he got along well with everybody, but he had an affair a couple of years ago.
Just hours after finding her husband's body, Ann informed police that he cheated on her. Naturally, the admission led directly to the detective's next question.
How did you handle that affair?
I love Bill very much. I don't think I really trusted him again. And I think he knew that.
Anne went on to explain that Bill had ended the affair and that she and her husband had been trying to patch things up. But the other woman, according to Anne, didn't take Bill's scorn lightly.
She tells me during this first interview that, well, there are some issues.
The woman, according to Anne, had stalked Bill. Anne told police the stalker had regularly sent the family threatening emails, harassed them with frequent phone calls, and even stolen Bill's gun. At least, that's what he'd suspected.
He has a gun that he filed a complaint with last week that was stolen. And that was our handgun.
He filed a complaint last week.
Yeah, at the sheriff's department.
Do you know what kind of gun?
I only know it's called a Beretta, but I don't know what kind.
He came to the sheriff's office and said, look, I don't know if this gun was stolen or not, but I can't find it. And I've had problems with this Barbara Miller. She possibly took my gun.
And the stolen pistol just happened to match the caliber of the shell casing found under Bill's pillow.
It was a 9mm Beretta handgun, probably one of Bill's favorites.
Was it the murder weapon? And more importantly, who was this other woman who'd supposedly stolen it?
Her name is Barbara Miller.
Did that mean Bill's old flame might have been involved in his death? It was certainly starting to sound that way. Without tipping off their potential suspect, sheriff's investigators started making inquiries.
Her involvement in this case was something that we started working on immediately, exploring what her whereabouts or her activities for the day before and of the murder.
One task remained, however, before police considered Barbara a prime suspect rather than a mere person of interest. They had to rule out the people closest to Bill. That night in the neighbor's garage, the detectives asked Anne to walk them through the weekend before Bill's death. According to Anne, her husband had spent Saturday afternoon riding his motorcycle.
What time did he get home?
Late. I was already cooking Matthew's dinner. And it was light. Because I seen him drive up when I was outside barbecuing.
Anne said they'd all sat down to a steak dinner, and then she and Bill shared a quiet evening at home.
Matthew went to a bonfire.
Okay.
Then it was kind of nice, just the two of us. It was nice.
The next day, according to Anne, Bill had slept in while she and Matthew had gotten up early and gone to Missoula.
We went to the Walmart, and then from Walmart, we went to the mall.
The trip itself may have been ordinary, but the return home was anything but.
They've been shopping, so they start carrying their groceries into the house. She says, I call out to Bill, hey, we're home. And then she says, I go into the bedroom and I find Bill's body. And she said, I hollered for Matthew that we have to leave.
Questioned by the police that same night, Matthew confirmed his mother's statement, starting with Saturday's dinner.
I think it might have been some steak. There might have been a salad or something. I don't eat vegetables.
According to Matthew, he'd last seen his father alive at dinner. He told police that his dad was already in bed by the time he got home from the bonfire and had slept in the next morning while he and his mom went shopping in Missoula.
We left the house about 8:15, 8:30. My dad was sleeping.
Matthew also confirmed Anne's account of their shopping trip.
I went to the mall. And after the mall, we dropped off some clothes and things at the Goodwill.
Matt's right there. He's with her the whole time.
Receipts recovered from the Stout shopping bag strengthened the alibi. All police had to do now was send investigators to Missoula to see if it checked out. In the meantime, detectives secured a warrant and started combing the Stout residence for clues. Sheriff Chris Hoffman was passing through the garage when something about Bill's motorcycle caught his eye.
The saddlebag was unlatched. That was unusual. I mean, not terribly out of the ordinary, but for me it would be, and for most of the people that I ride with.
But if the unlatched flap piqued the sheriff's curiosity, it was nothing compared to what waited inside.
He calls other officers over there, and they find a pistol in that saddlebag.
It was a 9mm Beretta.
The same make and caliber as the one described as stolen.
Police suspected it was also the murder weapon. But if the Beretta had been used to kill Bill, would the shooter's prints still be on the gun? The police weren't hopeful. And the reason had to do with a crucial clue that the detectives had found in the Stout's laundry room. A single latex glove.
The latex glove was found buried halfway in her laundry hamper.
Had the killer worn the glove?
The glove that we recover out of that laundry basket, we submit to the crime lab and we process it for gunshot residue and DNA.
But would the results confirm what Ann and her sons apparently assumed? That Barbara Miller had killed Bill Stout.
This Barbara Miller character, we're all terrified of her.
Coming up, what had started as an open and shut case of fatal attraction suddenly gets complicated.
We're starting to get an idea that possibly Bill's death was much earlier than what we had assumed.
On Monday morning, June 11, 2007, it had been less than 24 hours since Ann Stout called 911 and reported finding her husband Bill dead in their bedroom. Police already had a suspect, however. Both Ann and her son Matthew had pointed the finger firmly at a woman named Barbara Miller.
They told me that Barbara Miller could be a suspect if it was a homicide.
An old high school sweetheart of Bill's, they reunited for a brief affair 2 years before his death. But when Bill had ended the affair, according to Ann and Matthew, Barbara apparently hadn't taken the rejection lightly.
They were very concerned, telling me about strange, stalking type behavior they believed was coming from Barbara.
There were various emails sent to Bill Stout. There were also letters that were received by different neighbors of the Stouts and friends of the Stouts.
And if Barbara was Bill's stalker, didn't it stand to reason that she'd had something to do with his murder? The police weren't sure. For starters, how did she get into the house? There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle.
The television was on. The house seemed pretty together. It wasn't all disheveled.
The crime scene wasn't entirely clean, however. Someone had left one potentially critical clue behind.
When we went into the laundry room, we recovered a glove.
While the medical examiner took Bill's body to the morgue for autopsy, sheriff's deputies sent the glove off to the crime lab for DNA analysis. But would the results confirm that Barbara had been the shooter? The next morning, going over the evidence gathered at the scene, the detectives began to have their doubts. For starters, there was the 9mm Beretta that investigators suspected of being the murder weapon. Bill had reported it stolen just over a week before his death, a theft he blamed on Barbara Miller.
Bill told me that he had had a brief affair with her and that since the affair he's been having continuing trouble with her, and that's why he believes she's the one that was in his house.
But if Barbara had stolen the gun in order to shoot Bill, why had the police found it stashed on Bill's motorcycle?
I don't ever remember working a firearms theft where somebody stole a gun and then brought it back and put it somewhere else.
And if Barbara didn't ditch it at the scene, how did it get there? What if the person who'd stolen the gun wasn't Barbara? Suddenly, the whole stalking story was starting to sound suspicious to police, and very convenient for Ann.
That's the trail that Ann herself sent us down. This is, clearly what she wanted us to be working on.
There was, however, another trail the investigators could follow. The trail of phone calls, letters, and emails that Bill believed had come from Barbara. The investigators seized the Stout family's 3 computers.
I received the computers, the letters, the facts as the sheriff's office had developed them, and told to take a look.
While the forensics experts tried to crack the origin of the mysterious emails, The detectives went straight to the alleged source. On June 12th, after getting a call from Montana police, Arkansas authorities paid Barbara Miller a visit.
The Crawford County police came out to talk to me. After the interview started going, it became a little more intense, like about my whereabouts. Then I finally asked, am I a suspect? And I think the way they worded it was like a person of interest.
Barbara admitted sending one email threatening to come to Montana, but she told detectives it had been an idle threat made in the heat of the moment.
I had no intentions of going. I was angry because he didn't call me. I thought that would have been the big thing to do.
Not only did Barbara deny being Bill's stalker, according to what she told investigators, Ann had spent the affair's aftermath pestering her.
She called me periodically to check on me and pretend to be my friend and see what I was doing.
Police couldn't help but wonder why Ann would contact Barbara if Barbara was the one supposedly stalking her family.
She introduced us to Barbara Miller and this situation with her husband.
Was Ann deliberately creating a smokescreen to conceal the killer's true identity? If so, who was she trying to protect? Noah had been out of town, and Ann and Matthew had been caught by traffic cameras on their way to and from Missoula, confirming their alibis. So while her behavior toward Barbara Miller was suspicious, how could she be a suspect when she was in Missoula at the time Bill was shot? During the autopsy on June 11th, the medical examiner found the answer in an unexpected place: Bill Stout's stomach.
There was steak and broccoli and possibly some potatoes.
It was, based on what Matthew Stout had told investigators at the scene, the meal they'd shared on Saturday night.
It might have been some steak. There might have been a salad or something. I don't eat vegetables.
But if Bill had been killed sometime on Sunday, while Ann and Matt were shopping in Missoula, why would Saturday's dinner still be in his stomach?
The next day, those items should not be in his stomach at all. So we're starting to get an idea that possibly Bill's death was much earlier than what we had assumed.
That's certainly what the medical examiner thought.
The steak led him to believe that Bill Stout had died no later than 11 o'clock Saturday night.
In other words, he'd been shot right in the middle of the window of time and admitted she'd been alone with Bill.
Now, if you went to a bonfire,
Okay.
then it was kind of nice, just the two of us.
Who's got access to Bill? After he eats steak and broccoli, Ann Stout's got access. Ann Stout's the last person, by her own admission, that ever saw Bill alive.
Sheriff's investigators asked Ann to come in for a few questions. When she walked into the interrogation room at the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office on Friday, June 15th, she wasn't alone.
She came into the interview with an attorney.
Did Ann know police considered her a suspect? Detective Johnson did his best to put her at ease. He opened the interview by going back over the details of her earlier statements. Walking her through the dinner she'd shared with Matthew and Bill the night before, he casually brought up the menu.
Okay, so there's baked potato, broccoli, and steak.
Bill, by Ann's own admission, had eaten broccoli for dinner. Of course, Detective Johnson already knew that. He told Ann as much.
We've got two medical examiners that took a look at this. They told me what Bill had for dinner.
And the detective hinted Bill's last meal wasn't all the medical examiners had been able to tell him.
They could determine some things as a result of their examination, and one of them was time of death.
What was his time of death?
Well, actually, I wish that you would tell me that.
Oh, God.
I would like to work through this with you.
You are asking me a question that I don't have the answer for.
Well, actually, I think that I'm asking you a question that you don't want to answer.
Oh, gosh.
Detective Johnson had just, in so many words, informed Ann that she was the prime suspect in her husband's murder. Next, he pressed for a confession.
What actually happened the other night?
I don't know what you're asking, or I'm not sure what you want me to respond.
Well,
I think that we have...
here's what I would ask you to respond. I'll tell you that we will, if you want, work our way through all of this. But I'll tell you also that the results of our investigation show that you killed Bill.
They do not show that. They do not prove that, and you do not know that, because it did not happen.
I can assure you that I do know. I can tell you that I know the time of death. I can tell you that we recovered the firearm.
But the harder Detective Johnson pressed, the more adamant Ann became.
You may not be lying, but you were not informed. I did not do that.
Ann became so agitated that her attorney eventually stepped in and stopped the interview.
No, it wasn't like that.
Well then...
Oh, no, you have it so mistaken.
No, I don't have it.
Yes, you do. Please, you have it mistaken.
Her, I'll take Her attorney asked me to be able to speak to her alone. I left the room, and when I came back in, he told me that he didn't want me to ask her any more questions.
There was only one thing left to do. As the officers prepared to cuff Ann, she panicked.
He's going to get in custody.
Oh, God! I'm not tough. Please. I don't even think I needed an attorney. Please. You have to take me into custody. You know where I'm at. I'll give you my passport. I have it. You can take any physical object. You can release me to somebody's custody. You don't know me. You don't know me.
Ann?
What?
You're under the arrest for the murder of Bill Stout.
Coming up, explosive new evidence seems to confirm what Ann maintained all along. The stalker killed Bill. But who was the stalker?
I found what seemed to be a smoking gun, which was a simple phrase of, "Welcome, freak of Arc."
On June 2nd, 2008, Ann Stout walked into a Ravalli County, Montana courtroom to stand trial for the murder of her husband, Bill. It was 8 days short of a year since she dialed 911 to report finding her husband dead. In the interim, even since her arrest, family and friends had rallied around Ann in support.
We all knew in our hearts, there's no way Ann did this. There's no way. I mean, it's not possible.
Why wouldn't they believe Ann was innocent? After all, most of Bill's friends had been well aware of the trouble he'd been having with an ex-girlfriend named Barbara Miller.
You have this woman that is causing all these problems, sending all these emails, the eggs on the truck, the phone calls.
But who exactly was the woman causing all these problems? According to the prosecutor's opening statement, it wasn't Barbara Miller. The prosecutor admitted she'd had an affair with Bill, but she didn't kill him. In fact, according to the prosecution, she didn't even stalk him.
And basically stalked and terrorized her own family.
It wasn't a single incident. It wasn't limited to him. It involved his sons. His family and friends were aware of it. Bill was humiliated.
It was, prosecutors claimed, supposed to be the perfect cover.
This was a woman who was playing a victim, but in turn took an honest man's life.
To prove Ann murdered Bill, first they had to prove she was his stalker. On June 4th, prosecutors called computer forensics investigator Jimmy Wegg to the stand.
Ann Stout claimed that Barbara Miller sent emails, the threatening emails, to the Stout family using an email address of Freak of Arc, meaning, of course, Freak of Arkansas, a Yahoo email account.
Agent Wegg had led attempts to trace the origin of those emails.
In combing through all of these unused areas or sectors of the system, I found what seemed to be a smoking gun, which was a simple phrase of "Welcome, Freak of Arc," because "Welcome anyone" is the greeting we receive when we log on to our Yahoo account.
But did that necessarily mean the Freak of Arc emails were actually from Anne? On cross, Weg couldn't say.
I could not testify as to who was sitting at the keyboard, and that's true in almost every case.
But prosecutors could prove who definitely wasn't sitting at that keyboard: Barbara Miller. On June 10th, Barbara took the stand for the prosecution.
As the trial progressed, we keep hearing Barbara Miller, Barbara Miller. She's not what I expected. She's a smaller woman, very nice, soft-spoken.
Barbara certainly didn't look capable of murder, and in this case her appearance couldn't be deceiving. There was no way Barbara could have shot Bill.
We were able to absolutely eliminate her as someone that did this.
How? The night Bill was murdered in Montana, security cameras recorded Barbara in a Walmart checkout line. An Arkansas Walmart.
They brought the videotape we saw. Here they are pushing the cart out of Walmart on the night that he was murdered.
Barbara told the jury she hadn't spoken to Bill since the affair ended, and she said she'd had good reason to stay away. Not only had Anne been terrorizing her own family, she had also been pestering Barbara.
She would just out of the blue call me every 3 months. I just didn't know what she wanted. I just didn't know why she was calling me.
As Barbara's testimony continued, Anne made no attempt to disguise her emotion.
It was as if you could see these dark, rumbling clouds building and building inside of Anne.
Had the affair made Anne angry enough to commit murder? The prosecution believed so. And while they didn't have her fingerprints on the murder weapon, the prosecutors could still offer jurors direct proof that put the gun that killed Bill into Anne's own hand. The crime lab report on the latex glove recovered in the Stout's laundry room.
We get a result back that's positive for particles of gunshot residue.
The gunshot residue suggested the killer had worn the gloves in order to keep fingerprints off the gun. However, according to the lab technician's testimony, the killer's plan hadn't worked out.
The glove was found with Anne's DNA on the inside and Bill Stout's DNA on the outside. If that's not enough of a red-handed "I did this," I don't know what is.
On June 11th, the prosecution rested. That afternoon, Anne Stout's attorney started presenting her defense. It had been a year and a day since his client had found her husband Bill's body. But that was all she'd done, according to the defense. But if Anne didn't kill Bill, and Barbara couldn't have, who did?
Our pathologist said that it looked more like suicide. Everything that he saw clearly indicated, including the autopsy photos, that Bill had shot himself.
The theory, as the defense reminded jurors, matched the first impression of the police at the crime scene. But police had ruled it out because the gun wasn't in the bedroom near the body. Had they been too quick in their judgment? Could there be another explanation?
Somebody came along and moved the evidence.
Someone was shocked enough to change the scene because of how hard it was for Anne when Ben died. They didn't want her to go through the same trauma.
But what about Anne's DNA on the inside of the glove and the gunshot residue on the outside? According to the defense, it only proved Anne had worn the glove.
They didn't demonstrate that Anne had worn the glove to shoot the gun. Someone who may have moved it out to the garage could have had that glove on.
On June 12th, Anne Stout took the stand in her own defense.
The courtroom was pretty well packed. Everybody's wanting to hear what's going on. What is her side of the story?
It was a sad story that Anne's attorney walked her through. The loss of a son, Bill's infidelity, his death, and her subsequent arrest.
She was trying to convey to the jurors that I'm a real person. Look at me, I'm just like you. These terrible things have happened to me, and look at the person that I am. I would never do this.
She seemed scared and nervous, a worried, very insecure, very sad woman.
Anne had reason to be scared. When her testimony ended on Friday, June 13th, 12 jurors were all that stood between Anne and life in prison. Coming up, the verdict.
The jury gets called in pretty early, and my mom is, obviously worried. I mean, she's terrified.
Bill Stout had been dead for little more than a year when the jury retired to determine whether his wife Anne had killed him. Charged with deliberate homicide, she faced up to life in prison if convicted. But first, the jurors had to decide which Anne was the real one, the deranged stalker, or the quiet, demure woman sitting at the defense table.
It was a lovely mother, a devoted wife, a mother of 3 kids, active in the community, versus a very malicious, vindictive, alone and hurt woman who chose homicide as her way to manifest her emotions.
On the afternoon of June 19th, after 8.5 hours of deliberation, the jury announced it had reached a verdict.
The jury gets called in pretty early, and my mom is, obviously worried. I mean, she's terrified.
Moments later, the court clerk read the verdict. Guilty.
I expected her to fall apart, put her hands over her face, cry. So she just stood there.
Was she resigned to her fate, knowing what she had done? Or was Anne simply stunned by the fact that her life had taken yet another tragic turn?
She's just so gone in shock that, I don't think she has any idea what's going on.
Noah Stout is still struggling to accept the jury's verdict. But one thing remains certain. Anne is his mother, even if she did kill his father.
I'm not saying that she's innocent. I'm not saying that she's guilty. I'm just saying that she's my mom. I'm going to support her because she's my mom.
December 17th, Sill, 1974. Fort Worth, Texas, settled into another cold winter night. Christmas lights glowed along quiet streets. Families finished dinner. Teenagers filled movie theaters, diners, and parking lots, chasing the final weeks of freedom before the holidays. Nothing about that evening hinted that one young couple was about to step into a nightmare that would haunt an entire city for nearly half a century. It began with a promise. Just a date. Just another teenager driving home after spending the evening together. The kind of night that disappears into memory without anyone ever realizing it was the last ordinary moment. Carla Jan Walker was 17 years old. She was bright, athletic, and full of plans that stretched far beyond high school. Friends remembered her contagious laugh. Teachers described her as responsible and determined. To her family, she was simply Carla, a daughter who still had Christmas presents waiting under the tree. She had no enemies, and no dangerous secrets, and no reason to believe someone was already watching. That night, Carla and her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, had gone to a local dance before stopping in a parking lot near Benbrook Lake to talk, something countless teenage couples had done before them. It felt private, peaceful, safe enough. The engine was off. The radio played softly. Outside, the winter air settled over the empty lot. Then everything changed. A blinding flashlight suddenly burst through the darkness. The beam swept across the windshield. Rodney barely had time to react before someone yanked open the driver's side door. Standing outside was a man with a gun. No warning. No hesitation. No demand for money. Just cold violence. The stranger forced Rodney out of the car at gunpoint. He struck him repeatedly, beating him with terrifying efficiency. Every second felt unreal. Rodney fought back as best he could, but the attacker was stronger, faster, completely in control. Then came the words that would echo inside Rodney's mind for the rest of his life. As the gunman ordered Carla out of the vehicle, she screamed. Rodney tried to reach her. Another brutal blow sent him crashing to the ground. The attacker shoved Carla into another vehicle parked nearby. Its engine roared. Its headlights disappeared into the darkness. And just like that, she was gone. No one knew her exact destination. And no one knew the man's name. The parking lot fell silent again, as though nothing had happened. Except one young woman had vanished. Rodney staggered toward help, bleeding and disoriented. Every sentence he spoke sounded impossible even to himself. Someone had kidnapped Carla. Someone had been waiting. Police responded quickly. The initial hours after an abduction are often the most critical. Officers searched nearby roads, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, fields, and lake shores. Patrol cars flooded the surrounding neighborhoods. Every passing minute felt heavier than the last. Hope faded with sunrise. 2 days later, on December 19th, searchers made a devastating discovery in a remote area of western Tarrant County. There, hidden among the brush, lay Carla Walker. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. The teenager who had simply gone out on a date would never return home. News spread through Fort Worth with astonishing speed. Parents looked at their children differently. Teenagers canceled weekend plans. Young couples who once believed quiet parking lots were harmless suddenly saw every shadow as a possible threat. Fear became part of daily life. This was not simply another homicide. It felt random, predatory, the kind of crime that convinced an entire community that evil could appear without warning. Investigators rushed to process the crime scene with every forensic technique available in 1974. Today, crime scene investigators carry portable DNA kits, advanced digital scanners, and databases connecting millions of profiles around the world. Back then, none of those tools existed. Every clue depended on careful observation, photographs, and fingerprints, fibers, hair samples, tire impressions, witness statements. Investigators recovered physical evidence from Carla's clothing and body. They carefully preserved biological material that, at the time, could not reveal the identity of the person who left it behind. They collected everything they believed might someday matter, even if science had not yet caught up with the mystery. It was an act of faith. No one in that room could have imagined that those sealed evidence packages would remain untouched by certainty for decades. Rodney became the investigation's most important witness. Despite suffering a violent assault, he described every detail he could remember. The attacker's height, his build, his voice, the weapon, the sequence of events, the possible vehicle involved. Trauma blurred many details, but Rodney never stopped cooperating. He wanted only one thing: justice for Carla. Police began interviewing hundreds of people: friends, neighbors, former classmates, co-workers, known offenders, anyone who might have crossed paths with Carla. Nothing connected. The crime appeared terrifyingly random. Investigators also explored another disturbing possibility. Could this man have attacked before? Had another young woman narrowly escaped? Were there unsolved assaults sharing similar characteristics? Every lead generated new questions. None produced the killer. Rumors spread almost immediately. Some believed Carla had recognized her attacker. Others insisted a serial predator was hunting around Fort Worth. Anonymous phone calls poured into police stations. False confessions appeared. Psychics claimed supernatural visions. Every rumor demanded attention. Every dead end stole valuable time. Weeks became months. Months became years. Evidence boxes filled shelves inside police storage rooms. Detectives retired. New detectives inherited thick files assembled by people they had never met. Each investigator opened the same folders, the same photographs, the same witness interviews, the same unanswered questions. Every generation believed they might finally solve it. Every generation walked away frustrated. Yet one decision made in those earliest days quietly changed everything. Investigators never discarded the biological evidence. In the 1970s, it was impossible to imagine DNA profiling as modern investigators know it today. The evidence could not identify anyone then, but it was preserved according to the standards of the time because experienced detectives understood one simple truth: science changes. Evidence only matters if it survives long enough for science to catch up. That foresight would become one of the most important decisions ever made in the case. As the years passed, Fort Worth changed. New neighborhoods appeared. Highways expanded. Businesses replaced open fields. Children who had heard Carla's story grew into parents themselves. Many younger residents recognized her name without realizing the investigation was still officially unsolved. The case became something larger than one family. It became a symbol, a reminder that some wounds refuse to heal simply because time passes. For Carla's family, every Christmas carried another empty chair. Every birthday marked another year stolen. Every anniversary reopened memories they had tried desperately to survive. Hope changed shape over time. At first, hope meant Carla might somehow come home alive. Then hope became finding the killer quickly. Eventually, hope became something quieter. That someone, somewhere, would finally tell the truth. But silence proved stronger. The man responsible disappeared back into ordinary life. He worked. He aged. He blended into crowds. He watched decades unfold while detectives continued searching for someone whose face remained trapped inside one survivor's fading memory. He may have believed the investigation had died. Many killers do. Time has a strange way of creating confidence. Witnesses forget. Evidence deteriorates. Detectives retire. Families grow older. Headlines disappear. Cases gather dust. The illusion becomes comforting. If enough years pass, perhaps justice simply gives up. Yet hidden inside a sealed evidence envelope, invisible to every detective in 1974, rested something the killer never considered. Not a fingerprint. Not a witness. Not a confession. But something far smaller. Far quieter. A biological signature unique to one individual. That had no voice. It could not accuse anyone. It simply waited. Waiting became its own form of persistence. The case entered what investigators call a cold case, not because anyone stopped caring, but because every available lead had been exhausted. Cold cases are not abandoned. They are suspended between possibility and limitation, waiting for new evidence, new witnesses, or new technology to change what is possible. And while Carla's file remained on the shelf, forensic science transformed the world outside. In the 1980s, DNA profiling emerged. In the 1990s, it became a powerful investigative tool. In the decades that followed, laboratories learned to recover genetic material from increasingly smaller and older samples. Cases once considered impossible suddenly reopened. Across the United States, murderers who believed they had escaped forever began hearing unexpected knocks at their doors. Some had hidden for 20 years, others for 30. Each arrest sent a clear message through law enforcement. Time no longer protected the guilty. If evidence had survived, the past could still speak. Inside the Fort Worth Police Department, detectives watched these breakthroughs with growing determination. Every solved cold case raised the same question. Could Carla Walker's evidence still hold the answer? Could something collected in 1974 survive long enough to identify a killer who had vanished into history? The possibility seemed almost unbelievable. But impossible cases have a habit of changing the moment someone dares to look again. And somewhere beyond the aging folders, beyond the fading photographs, beyond decades of unanswered grief, a microscopic trail waited patiently for the day science would finally recognize its voice. The investigation into Carla Walker's murder did not end when the headlines faded. In many ways, it was only beginning. Detectives from the Fort Worth Police Department faced an extraordinarily difficult challenge. They had a victim, a surviving eyewitness to the abduction, and carefully preserved physical evidence. Yet they lacked the one piece of information that could transform suspicion into certainty: the identity of the man responsible. In the days following the discovery of Carla's body, investigators conducted hundreds of interviews. Friends, classmates, neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who might have crossed paths with the 17-year-old were questioned. Rodney McCoy, despite the physical and emotional trauma he had endured, worked closely with detectives. He described the sequence of events repeatedly, hoping that one overlooked detail might point investigators in the right direction. His account remained remarkably consistent. An armed stranger had approached without warning, assaulted him, abducted Carla, and disappeared into the darkness. There was no indication that the attacker knew either of them personally. The crime appeared to be one of opportunity rather than revenge, making the investigation significantly more complex. Without a clear suspect, detectives expanded their search. They reviewed reports of similar assaults in North Texas, looking for patterns that might connect Carla's murder to other violent crimes. Known offenders were questioned. Tips arrived from across Texas and beyond. Every credible lead demanded attention, but each ultimately reached the same destination: another dead end. The limitations of forensic science in the mid-1970s posed another obstacle. Investigators had collected biological evidence during the autopsy and preserved it carefully, recognizing its potential importance. At the time, however, there was no scientific method capable of identifying an individual through DNA. Blood typing and other laboratory techniques could narrow possibilities in some cases, but they could not provide the definitive answers that modern investigators now take for granted. Rather than discard the evidence, police stored it according to the standards of the era. That decision reflected a broader philosophy shared by experienced investigators: preserve everything that might someday matter. While no one could predict future scientific advances, they understood that evidence lost could never be recovered. As months turned into years, the case gradually entered what law enforcement refers to as cold case status. The designation did not mean the investigation was closed. Instead, it meant that every available lead had been exhausted with the tools then available. Detectives periodically reviewed the file whenever new information surfaced, but no breakthrough emerged. For Carla's family, the passage of time offered little comfort. Public attention inevitably shifted toward newer tragedies, yet the loss remained constant. Birthdays, holidays, and family milestones served as painful reminders of the future Carla never had the opportunity to experience. The case also left a lasting impact on the Fort Worth community. Parents became more cautious about where their children spent evenings. Young couples thought differently about secluded parking areas that had once seemed harmless. Carla Walker's murder became one of the city's most recognized unsolved crimes, remembered not only for its brutality, but also for the unanswered questions it left behind. During the 1980s, a revolution quietly began transforming criminal investigations around the world. Scientists developed techniques that allowed investigators to compare DNA recovered from crime scenes with DNA obtained from suspects. Cases that once depended almost entirely on eyewitness testimony could now be supported or contradicted by biological evidence. Initially, the technology required relatively large and well-preserved samples. Many older cases remained beyond its reach. Nevertheless, detectives responsible for long unsolved investigations watched these developments with increasing interest. If laboratory methods continued to improve, evidence collected decades earlier might eventually become useful. By the 1990s and early 2000s, DNA analysis had become one of the most powerful tools available to law enforcement. Advances in extraction techniques allowed laboratories to recover usable genetic profiles from increasingly small or degraded samples. Across the United States, cold cases that had remained unsolved for decades suddenly produced new investigative leads. Some of those breakthroughs came after suspects were arrested for unrelated crimes and required to submit DNA samples under expanding state and federal laws. Others resulted from improvements in laboratory sensitivity that made previously unusable evidence suitable for testing. Even so, Carla Walker's case remained unresolved. Investigators periodically revisited the evidence, asking the same question: was there enough surviving biological material to produce a reliable DNA profile? Each advance in forensic science renewed optimism, but optimism alone could not solve the case. The evidence had to be preserved well enough to withstand decades of storage, and any resulting DNA profile would still require a matching individual for comparison. Meanwhile, new generations of detectives inherited responsibility for the investigation. They studied reports written by officers who had long since retired. They examined photographs taken with film cameras decades before the digital era. They retraced investigative decisions, verifying that every significant lead had been pursued. Cold case investigations often require extraordinary patience. Unlike active investigations, where witnesses and evidence are immediately available, cold cases demand that detectives reconstruct events separated from the present by years or even decades. Memories fade. Witnesses relocate or pass away. Physical locations change dramatically. What remains constant is the evidence preserved at the time of the crime. In Carla Walker's case, that preserved evidence became increasingly valuable as forensic science advanced. By the late 2010s, Another major innovation had begun reshaping homicide investigations: forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA database searches, which rely primarily on profiles collected from convicted offenders or crime scene evidence, forensic genetic genealogy can use publicly available genealogical databases when participants have chosen to make their data available for law enforcement matching under applicable policies to identify potential biological relatives of an unknown suspect. Investigators can then construct family trees and narrow the search to individuals who fit the circumstances of the crime. This approach had already contributed to solving several high-profile cold cases across the United States, demonstrating that even decades-old crimes could sometimes be solved without a direct DNA match already existing in criminal databases. Recognizing these advances, Fort Worth investigators decided it was time to take another careful look at Carla Walker's case. The preserved biological evidence was submitted for modern analysis using techniques unavailable in 1974. Advances in laboratory science allowed forensic experts to recover and interpret genetic material that earlier generations could not fully examine. The investigation, once constrained by the scientific limits of its time, entered an entirely new phase. For detectives, this was not simply a matter of rerunning old tests. It required combining historical investigative work with 21st-century forensic methods. Every document collected over decades suddenly became relevant again. Every preserved piece of evidence was reviewed in light of technologies that the original investigators could scarcely have imagined. The question that had lingered for more than 4 decades remained the same. Could science finally identify the man who had abducted and murdered Carla Walker on that December night in 1974? For the Walker family, expectations were understandably cautious. Years of unanswered questions had taught them not to assume that every new development would lead to an arrest. Yet the progress occurring in forensic science offered something that had been difficult to sustain over so many years: a realistic possibility that the truth could still emerge. The investigation was no longer relying solely on fading memories or incomplete descriptions. Instead, it was increasingly guided by objective scientific evidence preserved across generations. What had once appeared to be a silent collection of stored materials was becoming an active source of information. The path forward remained complex, requiring extensive laboratory work, genealogical research, and careful verification before any conclusions could be reached. But for the first time in decades, the case was moving with renewed momentum. The evidence had endured. The science had evolved, and after more than 40 years, investigators found themselves closer than ever to answering the question that had haunted Fort Worth since the winter of 1974. The renewed investigation into Carla Walker's murder reflected a broader shift in modern policing. Across the United States, cold case units were revisiting files that had once been considered unsolvable, combining meticulous detective work with rapidly advancing forensic science. Cases that had remained dormant for decades were producing arrests, not because witnesses suddenly remembered new details, but because technology had reached a point where evidence collected years earlier could finally reveal information that had always been present. For investigators in Fort Worth, the preserved biological evidence from the 1974 crime scene became the focal point of the inquiry. Forensic specialists applied modern DNA extraction methods to material that had been carefully stored for decades. The work required extraordinary care. Evidence that old can be fragile, and every laboratory procedure must be performed under strict quality standards to avoid contamination and ensure reliable results. The analysis produced something detectives had long hoped for: a usable DNA profile believed to belong to the perpetrator. Yet obtaining a profile was only the first step. Unless that profile matched someone already present in a law enforcement DNA database, investigators still needed another way to identify the individual behind it. No immediate match appeared in the criminal databases available to investigators. In earlier decades, that outcome might have ended the investigation once again. Instead, detectives turned to one of the most significant investigative developments of the 21st century: forensic genetic genealogy. Although often discussed in the media, forensic genetic genealogy is a carefully controlled investigative method rather than a shortcut to solving crimes. It begins with DNA recovered from crime scene evidence. That DNA is processed into a format suitable for comparison with genealogical databases that allow law enforcement use under specific conditions. Rather than identifying a suspect directly, the process searches for people who share portions of DNA with the unknown individual, often distant relatives rather than immediate family members. Even a distant genetic connection can provide investigators with valuable clues. Professional genealogists then begin reconstructing family histories using publicly available records such as census information, birth records, marriage records, obituaries, military service documents, newspaper archives, and other historical sources. The objective is to identify individuals who could logically fit within the family tree while also matching the known facts of the criminal investigation. It is painstaking work. There are no dramatic computer screens instantly revealing a suspect's name. Instead, investigators may spend months tracing generations of relatives, comparing dates, locations, and family relationships until a much smaller group of possible individuals emerges. The success of this process depends not only on science but also on traditional investigative techniques. Detectives must verify every assumption independently, ensuring that no conclusion rests solely on genealogy. As the investigation progressed, the Walker case followed this methodical path. Genetic relatives were identified. Family trees were constructed. Potential candidates gradually narrowed. Detectives compared ages, geographic locations, and personal histories with the known circumstances surrounding Carla Walker's abduction and murder. One name eventually drew increasing attention. The individual had lived in the Fort Worth area during the 1970s. His age aligned with witness descriptions from the time. Additional aspects of his background made him a person investigators believed warranted closer examination. At this stage, however, suspicion alone was not enough. The standards required for a criminal prosecution demand far more than probability. Investigators needed to determine whether the individual's own DNA matched the genetic profile recovered from the preserved evidence. Obtaining that confirmation required another carefully planned investigative step. Rather than relying solely on genealogy, detectives conducted surveillance consistent with legal investigative practices. In many cold case investigations, investigators seek opportunities to recover DNA from items that a person has voluntarily discarded in public, such as beverage containers or other objects. If such evidence is lawfully obtained, laboratory scientists can compare the resulting DNA profile with the crime scene evidence. According to court records and public reporting, investigators in Carla Walker's case ultimately obtained a DNA sample associated with their suspect through lawful investigative means. The sample was submitted for forensic comparison. The laboratory's responsibility was straightforward but critical. The analysts did not know the emotional history of the case. They did not determine guilt. Their role was to compare biological evidence using established scientific procedures and report the results objectively. When the comparison was completed, investigators received the answer they had pursued for nearly half a century. The DNA profile from the crime scene matched the suspect. For detectives who had inherited the case decades after the crime occurred, the result represented the culmination of years of patient work. For members of Carla Walker's family, it marked the first significant breakthrough since 1974. Yet an investigation does not end with a laboratory report. Detectives still needed to assemble a comprehensive case capable of withstanding judicial scrutiny. They revisited witness statements collected decades earlier. They reviewed original investigative reports. They confirmed timelines. They examined historical records documenting where the suspect had lived and worked. Every available piece of evidence had to be evaluated together rather than in isolation. The passage of nearly 5 decades created unavoidable challenges. Some original investigators had retired. Others had passed away. Certain witnesses were no longer available for questioning. Memories that once seemed vivid had naturally faded over time. Recognizing these realities, prosecutors and investigators focused heavily on objective evidence records preserved contemporaneously with the crime and modern forensic analysis performed according to current scientific standards. The importance of evidence preservation became increasingly clear. The detectives who collected biological samples in December 1974 could not have anticipated forensic genetic genealogy. They could not have predicted the remarkable advances in DNA technology that would emerge decades later. Nevertheless, their careful documentation and preservation practices ensured that future investigators would still have access to critical evidence. Their work demonstrated one of the fundamental principles of criminal investigation. Preserving evidence protects future possibilities, even when current technology cannot fully explain its significance. The Walker investigation also illustrated another important lesson. Cold cases are rarely solved through a single dramatic revelation. Instead, they are resolved through the accumulation of many carefully verified steps. A witness statement, a preserved exhibit, a laboratory result, a historical document, a genealogical connection. Each component supports the others until investigators reach a conclusion supported by the totality of the evidence. By early 2020, detectives believed they had assembled that foundation. After reviewing the investigative findings, prosecutors determined that sufficient evidence existed to move forward. An arrest warrant was prepared. For Carla Walker's family, the news carried emotions that were difficult to describe. Nearly 46 years had passed since the night she disappeared. Entire generations had grown up during the investigation. Children born after the murder had become parents themselves. Many people familiar with the case had wondered whether anyone would ever be held accountable. Now, after decades of uncertainty, the criminal justice system was preparing to take its next step. And the announcement also drew national attention. Journalists covering criminal justice and forensic science highlighted the case as another example of how modern DNA technology was reshaping long unsolved investigations. Experts emphasized that these breakthroughs depended not only on scientific innovation, but also on careful evidence preservation and patient investigative work extending across decades. The investigation into Carla Walker's murder had become more than a single homicide case. It had become an illustration of how historical evidence and modern science could intersect to answer questions once believed impossible to resolve. For detectives, however, one essential task remained. Identifying a suspect through DNA was a major achievement, but the criminal justice process still required that evidence be presented in court, examined through the adversarial process, and evaluated according to the legal standards governing criminal trials. The search for the truth had entered its final chapter, but the responsibility to establish the facts with fairness, accuracy, and respect for the rule of law remained unchanged. After nearly half a century, the investigation that had begun in a dark parking lot in December 1974 was finally approaching the courtroom, where decades of patient investigative work would be tested before a jury. The decision to seek an arrest marked one of the most significant developments in the history of the Carla Walker investigation. Nearly 46 years had passed since the crime, and every stage of the renewed inquiry had been conducted with the understanding that any future prosecution would depend on the strength and reliability of the evidence. Investigators knew that the passage of time would inevitably become part of the story presented in court. Their responsibility was not only to identify a suspect, but also to demonstrate how the evidence had been preserved, analyzed, and interpreted over the course of decades. In September 2020, Fort Worth police arrested Glenn Samuel McCurley, who was in his late 70s at the time. The arrest was the result of the renewed investigation that combined preserved biological evidence with modern DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy. For Carla Walker's family, the announcement represented a moment they had long hoped to see, but had never assumed would arrive. Law enforcement officials emphasized that the investigation had remained active, even during periods when there were no public developments. Detectives assigned to the case over the years had continued reviewing evidence whenever advances in forensic science offered new possibilities. The eventual breakthrough reflected the cumulative work of multiple generations of investigators, laboratory scientists, prosecutors, and forensic specialists, rather than the efforts of any single individual. Following the arrest, prosecutors formally charged McCurley with Carla Walker's murder. As with any criminal case, the filing of charges marked the beginning of judicial proceedings rather than their conclusion. The criminal justice system requires that evidence be presented in court, where it can be examined through established legal procedures. Preparing a homicide case involving events from 1974 presented unique challenges. Investigators revisited original reports prepared nearly half a century earlier, They verified evidence inventories, chain of custody documentation, laboratory records, and witness statements. Every physical exhibit introduced in court would need to be accounted for from the moment it had been collected until its presentation before a jury. Chain of custody is a fundamental principle in forensic investigations. It documents who collected an item of evidence, who handled it afterward, where it was stored, and how it was transferred between agencies or laboratories. Maintaining this record helps ensure that evidence presented in court is the same evidence recovered during the original investigation and has not been altered or contaminated. Because Carla Walker's case depended heavily on biological evidence preserved since 1974, establishing an unbroken chain of custody was particularly important. Prosecutors also prepared to explain scientific concepts that did not exist at the time of the murder. Jurors would need to understand not only the DNA analysis itself, but also how forensic genetic genealogy had guided investigators toward a potential suspect before traditional DNA comparison confirmed the match. Experts anticipated that the trial would provide an opportunity to educate the public about the distinction between investigative leads and courtroom evidence. Forensic genetic genealogy helped narrow the field of possible suspects. The direct DNA comparison between the crime scene evidence and the suspect's DNA provided the scientific evidence introduced to support the prosecution's case. The genealogy itself was an investigative tool, not the sole basis for criminal liability. As pretrial proceedings continued, journalists revisited the original events of December 1974. Newspaper archives, television reports, and interviews with retired investigators reminded audiences how profoundly the crime had affected Fort Worth. For many residents, the case had become part of local history, a tragedy remembered across generations. Members of Carla Walker's family also spoke publicly about the long wait for answers. They described decades of uncertainty, anniversaries marked by unanswered questions, and the emotional difficulty of revisiting events that had shaped their lives since the 1970s. While no legal proceeding could undo the loss they had experienced, the progress of the case represented an opportunity for the evidence to be heard in court. Throughout the process, investigators emphasized that solving cold cases often requires extraordinary patience. Contrary to popular portrayals in television dramas, breakthroughs rarely occur because of a single dramatic discovery. Instead, they result from the careful accumulation of verified facts, advances in scientific methods, and the willingness of investigators to continually reassess evidence as new technologies become available. The Carla Walker investigation demonstrated this principle clearly. If the biological evidence had been collected in 1974, DNA profiling developed years later. Forensic genetic genealogy emerged decades after that. Each advancement built upon work performed by previous generations of investigators. Without the original evidence collection, later DNA analysis would not have been possible. Without improvements in laboratory science, the preserved evidence might never have yielded a usable profile. Without careful genealogical research, investigators might not have identified the individual whose DNA ultimately matched the crime scene evidence. The case illustrated how criminal investigations can span multiple eras of scientific development while remaining grounded in the same objective, establishing facts through reliable evidence. As preparations for trial continued, attorneys on both sides examined thousands of pages of investigative materials. Witness lists included current investigators, forensic scientists, and individuals connected to the original investigation. Some testimony would address events from December 1974. Other testimony would explain laboratory procedures performed nearly 50 years later. The length of time between the crime and the prosecution inevitably became part of the legal discussion. Cortez recognized that delayed prosecutions can present practical challenges, including faded memories and unavailable witnesses. At the same time, advances in forensic science have made it possible to resolve cases that once appeared impossible to prove. The legal process must carefully balance these realities while ensuring that the defendant receives a fair trial and that the evidence is evaluated according to established legal standards. For the broader criminal justice community, the Walker case attracted significant attention because it demonstrated the increasing role of forensic technology in resolving historical investigations. Cold case units across the United States had already begun reviewing archived evidence with renewed optimism. Cases involving preserved biological material were being reassessed using techniques unavailable when the crimes occurred. Each successful prosecution reinforced the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining detailed records, and remaining open to future scientific developments. The investigation also underscored the importance of collaboration. Modern cold case investigations frequently involve local police departments, state forensic laboratories, prosecutors, forensic genealogists, and outside scientific experts. Each contributes specialized knowledge that, when combined, can help resolve investigations spanning several decades. No single discipline solves a case alone. Scientific evidence requires careful interpretation. Historical records require verification. Investigative findings require corroboration. Legal proceedings require proof that satisfies the applicable standard in court. The Carla Walker case reflected this multidisciplinary approach from beginning to end. As public interest grew, many observers viewed the case as evidence that technological advances were reshaping the pursuit of justice. Families of victims in other unsolved investigations followed the developments closely, hoping that similar methods might one day provide answers in their own cases. Law enforcement agencies likewise recognized that previously unsolved files could contain evidence capable of yielding new information if preserved properly. The Walker investigation became one example among many illustrating how careful evidence preservation and modern forensic science can complement each other across generations. Yet amid discussions of investigative methods and scientific breakthroughs, one fact remained at the center of the case. A 17-year-old high school student had left home expecting to return after an evening with her boyfriend. She never made it home. Everything that followed, the decades of investigation, the scientific advances, the courtroom proceedings, and the renewed public attention, began with that single loss. The purpose of the criminal justice process was not to rewrite history. It could not restore the life that had been taken. Its purpose was to determine responsibility based on evidence and to provide the legal system with the opportunity to evaluate that evidence fairly. After nearly half a century, the investigation had finally reached that point. The questions that had remained unanswered for generations were no longer confined to police files and archived reports. They were now entering a courtroom where decades of investigative work, preserved evidence, and modern forensic science would be examined together under the scrutiny of the judicial process. The courtroom proceedings in the Carla Walker case represented the culmination of nearly 5 decades of investigative work. By the time the case came before a jury, the evidence reflected both the investigative practices of the 1970s and the scientific capabilities of the 21st century. It was a rare intersection of history, forensic science, and the legal system, requiring jurors to consider events separated from their own lives by almost half a century. As with every criminal trial, the prosecution carried the burden of proving the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That burden remained unchanged despite the age of the case. The passage of time neither lowered nor raised the legal standard. Instead, it shaped the type of evidence available and the manner in which it would be presented. Prosecutors began by reconstructing the events of December 17, SIL, 1974. Through witness testimony and historical records, they described how Carla Walker and Rodney McCoy had spent the evening together before stopping in a parking area near Benbrook Lake. Rodney's account of the attack, first given in 1974 and preserved in investigative records, formed an important part of the historical narrative presented to the jury. The jury also heard how Rodney had been assaulted by an armed stranger before Carla was forced into another vehicle. His testimony over the years remained consistent regarding the essential sequence of events, even though the passage of time naturally affected certain details. Cortez routinely recognized that human memory changes over decades, and jurors are instructed to evaluate testimony in light of all the surrounding evidence. Investigators then explained the extensive search that followed Carla's disappearance and the tragic discovery of her body 2 days later. Evidence collected during the original investigation was introduced through witnesses who could explain how it had been documented, preserved, and maintained throughout the intervening decades. A significant portion of the trial focused on forensic science. Laboratory experts described how biological evidence collected in 1974 had been preserved according to accepted procedures of the time. They explained the methods used decades later to recover DNA suitable for modern analysis and the quality controls employed to ensure reliable laboratory results. For many jurors, this testimony provided insight into how forensic science has evolved. In 1974, investigators could collect biological evidence without possessing the technology to identify an individual through DNA. By the time of the renewed investigation, advances in molecular biology, laboratory instrumentation, and analytical methods allowed scientists to obtain information that had been inaccessible for generations. Expert witnesses carefully distinguished between investigative techniques and courtroom evidence. They explained that forensic genetic genealogy had assisted investigators in developing investigative leads by identifying possible biological relatives of the unknown contributor of the crime scene DNA. However, they also emphasized that genealogy itself was not the scientific comparison used to establish the DNA match presented in court. Instead, once investigators identified a potential suspect through lawful investigative methods, they obtained DNA suitable for forensic comparison. Laboratory analysts then compared the suspect's DNA profile directly with the profile developed from the preserved biological evidence. According to the prosecution's evidence, the profiles matched. Experts described the statistical significance of the comparison and the scientific procedures used to verify the findings. They explained laboratory protocols designed to minimize contamination, maintain chain of custody, and ensure that independent quality assurance standards were followed throughout the analytical process. The defense, as is customary in criminal proceedings, had the opportunity to cross-examine every prosecution witness. Cross-examination is a fundamental component of the adversarial legal system, allowing attorneys to test the reliability of testimony, explore potential weaknesses in the evidence, and challenge investigative conclusions before the jury. The age of the case naturally became one area of discussion. Defense attorneys questioned witnesses about the passage of nearly 5 decades between the crime and the prosecution. They examined issues relating to memory, evidence preservation, and investigative procedures, while prosecutors maintained that the preserved physical evidence and modern forensic analysis provided reliable answers independent of fading recollections. Throughout the proceedings, the judge instructed jurors that statements made by attorneys were not evidence. Their responsibility was to evaluate testimony, exhibits, and scientific findings presented during the trial and apply the law as instructed by the court. Beyond the scientific evidence, prosecutors also introduced historical investigative records documenting the extensive efforts made by law enforcement since 1974. These records illustrated that the case had never been forgotten, even during periods when no public developments occurred. Retired investigators, where available, described the original investigation and the limitations of forensic science at the time. Current detectives explained how modern techniques allowed them to revisit preserved evidence with capabilities unavailable to earlier generations. The continuity between these investigative efforts became one of the defining themes of the case. The original detectives had preserved evidence despite having no means to fully analyze it. Successive investigators maintained those records and periodically reviewed the case. Modern forensic scientists ultimately extracted new information from that preserved evidence. Together, these efforts formed a continuous investigative process spanning nearly half a century. The Walker case also drew attention from legal scholars and forensic professionals beyond Texas. It illustrated how advances in DNA technology were changing the practical realities of criminal investigations. Cold cases that once depended almost entirely upon eyewitness testimony could now be supported by objective biological evidence recovered decades earlier. At the same time, experts caution that every cold case presents unique circumstances. Not every investigation contains preserved biological evidence. Not every sample yields usable DNA. Not every DNA profile can identify a suspect. Success depends upon numerous factors, including evidence preservation, laboratory quality, investigative diligence, and the availability of lawful comparison methods. The Carla Walker investigation represented one example of these factors aligning successfully after decades of work. As testimony continued, members of Carla's family attended portions of the proceedings. Public reporting described the emotional significance of hearing details that had shaped their lives since 1974 presented once again in a courtroom. For many families affected by violent crime, criminal trials involve revisiting deeply painful events. At the same time, they provide an opportunity for evidence to be examined publicly within the framework of the justice system. Outside the courthouse, journalists continued explaining the broader significance of the case. Many reports emphasize the role of evidence preservation and modern forensic science rather than portraying the investigation as the result of a single dramatic breakthrough. Specialists interviewed by the media noted that successful cold case prosecutions typically depend upon years of methodical investigative work rather than isolated moments of discovery. The Walker case reinforced that observation. Every stage of the investigation built upon previous work. The original crime scene examination. The preservation of evidence. Repeated reviews by successive detectives. Scientific advances in DNA analysis. A forensic genetic genealogy. Direct forensic comparison. Legal review. Courtroom presentation. Each stage depended upon the integrity of the one before it. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, jurors had heard testimony spanning nearly 50 years of investigative history. They had examined physical evidence, listened to forensic experts, reviewed historical investigative records, and considered witness testimony describing both the events of 1974 and the scientific developments that ultimately reshaped the investigation. Their responsibility now approached its final phase. Under the American criminal justice system, jurors serve as the finders of fact. They evaluate the credibility of witnesses, consider the evidence admitted during trial, apply the legal instructions provided by the court, and determine whether the prosecution has established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After decades during which the central questions remained confined to investigative files, those questions had now been fully presented within the courtroom. The legal process was nearing the moment when evidence collected across nearly 5 decades would be weighed together, and the jury would decide whether the prosecution had met its burden under the law. As the presentation of evidence concluded, the Carla Walker murder trial entered one of the most consequential stages of any criminal proceeding, jury deliberations. For the jurors, the task was both straightforward in principle and complex in practice. They were instructed to consider only the evidence admitted during the trial, evaluate the credibility of witnesses, apply the law as explained by the judge, and determine whether the prosecution had proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The extraordinary history of the investigation did not alter that legal standard. Although the crime had occurred nearly 5 decades earlier, the defendant was entitled to the same constitutional protections afforded in every criminal case. Likewise, the prosecution remained responsible for establishing its case through reliable evidence rather than speculation or public opinion. The jury had heard testimony that spanned generations. They had listened to witnesses describe the original investigation in 1974. They had examined scientific evidence produced using laboratory techniques unavailable at the time of the crime. They had considered testimony explaining how DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy contributed to the renewed investigation. Now, the responsibility for reaching a verdict rested with them alone. In August 2021, after hearing the evidence presented during the trial, the jury found Glenn Samuel McCurley guilty of the murder of Carla Walker. Following the verdict, the same jury assessed punishment, sentencing him to life imprisonment under the applicable Texas law governing the offense. The verdict marked the legal conclusion of one of Texas's longest-running homicide investigations. For Carla Walker's family, it represented the first time a court had formally determined criminal responsibility for her death. While no verdict could undo the events of December 1974, the outcome concluded a legal process that had remained unfinished for nearly 47 years. Following the trial, members of law enforcement reflected publicly on the investigation. Detectives emphasized that the case demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining investigative records, and periodically reviewing unsolved cases as forensic science evolves. Many also acknowledged the work of investigators who had not lived to see the case resolved. The officers who responded to the crime scene in 1974, the detectives who interviewed witnesses during the original investigation, the laboratory personnel who preserved evidence using the best methods available at the time. Successive investigators who maintained the file during decades without significant breakthroughs. Each had contributed to the eventual resolution, even though many never witnessed its conclusion. Cold case investigations are often described as relay races rather than sprints. One generation of investigators carries the case as far as available evidence and technology allow. When progress becomes impossible, they preserve everything for those who follow. Years later, another generation resumes the work, sometimes benefiting from scientific advances unimaginable to their predecessors. The Carla Walker investigation reflected this pattern with remarkable clarity. The original investigators could not perform DNA analysis. The detectives of the 1990s could not yet use forensic genetic genealogy. Only by combining the work completed across multiple decades did investigators eventually identify the individual responsible. The case also became an important example in discussions of forensic science education. Universities, law enforcement training programs, and forensic organizations frequently emphasize that scientific evidence is only as valuable as the procedures used to collect and preserve it. Proper documentation, careful packaging, secure storage, and detailed chain of custody records all contribute to ensuring that evidence remains suitable for future examination. Had any of those steps failed in 1974, the outcome decades later might have been very different. Experts likewise noted that the Walker investigation illustrated the complementary relationship between science and traditional detective work. DNA did not solve the case independently. Investigators first preserved the evidence. Scientists developed analytical methods. Genealogists helped identify potential investigative leads. Detectives conducted lawful investigative follow-up. Prosecutors assembled the legal case. And the jury evaluated all of the evidence together. Each discipline played a distinct role within the broader criminal justice process. Following the verdict, attention also turned to the broader impact of forensic genetic genealogy. Since its emergence as an investigative technique, the method has contributed to solving numerous violent crimes that had remained unresolved for decades. At the same time, legal scholars, policymakers, and privacy experts continue discussing the appropriate safeguards governing its use. Many jurisdictions have developed policies requiring careful oversight, documentation, and legal review before employing forensic genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. The objective is to balance the significant public safety benefits of solving violent crimes with respect for privacy, transparency, and the ethical use of genetic information. The Walker investigation is often cited within that broader conversation because it illustrates both the promise and the complexity of applying emerging technology to historical cases. Beyond the courtroom, Carla Walker's story continued to resonate within Fort Worth. For residents who remembered the original news coverage, the verdict closed a chapter that had remained unfinished for nearly half a century. For younger generations, many of whom had learned about the case only after the arrest, it became a powerful example of how advances in science can reshape investigations long after crimes occur. Schools, local historians, and journalists revisited the events surrounding the case, not to sensationalize them, but to document an important chapter in the city's history. The investigation also reinforced a message frequently shared by cold case detectives. The term cold case does not mean investigators have abandoned hope. Rather, it describes cases awaiting new information, new witnesses, or new scientific capabilities. Many agencies across the United States maintain dedicated cold case units precisely because advances in forensic science continue creating opportunities that did not previously exist. Every preserved fingerprint, every biological sample, every carefully documented photograph, every properly stored piece of evidence. Each may one day provide information unavailable when the crime originally occurred. The Carla Walker investigation serves as one illustration of that principle. At the same time, investigators caution against assuming that every unsolved case will ultimately be resolved through DNA. Many historical investigations lack biological evidence entirely. Others involve evidence that has deteriorated beyond scientific usefulness. Some crimes simply leave behind too little physical evidence for modern analysis to overcome. For this reason, traditional investigative methods remain essential. Witness interviews, document review, and crime scene reconstruction, historical research, Community engagement. These continue to play vital roles alongside scientific advances. Looking back across nearly 5 decades, one feature of the Walker investigation stands out consistently: persistence. The original detectives persisted despite limited forensic tools. Subsequent investigators continued reviewing the evidence. Laboratory scientists applied increasingly sophisticated analytical methods. Genealogists pursued complex family histories. Family prosecutors carefully assembled the legal case. Jurors fulfilled their responsibility under the law. Each stage depended upon sustained commitment rather than sudden inspiration. The story therefore extends beyond the identification and conviction of one individual. It reflects the evolution of criminal investigation itself, from handwritten reports and film photography to digital forensic databases and advanced DNA sequencing. From traditional investigative interviews to sophisticated genealogical analysis. From evidence preserved in 1974 to courtroom testimony nearly half a century later. The investigation became a bridge connecting different eras of policing and forensic science. Today, the Carla Walker case is frequently referenced in discussions of cold case investigations because it demonstrates what can occur when evidence is preserved carefully and investigators remain willing to revisit historical cases as technology advances. Its lessons continue informing law enforcement training, forensic education, and public understanding of how science contributes to the pursuit of justice. While the legal proceedings concluded with a verdict and sentence, the broader significance of the case continues to influence investigators working on unsolved crimes across the country. Every cold case file contains its own unique challenges. Some may never be solved. Others may be waiting for the next scientific breakthrough. The Carla Walker investigation stands as a reminder that the passage of time does not necessarily erase evidence. Sometimes it simply delays humanity's ability to understand what that evidence has been preserving all along. Although the criminal proceedings had reached their conclusion, the significance of the Carla Walker case extended far beyond a single conviction. For investigators, forensic scientists, legal professionals, and historians, the case became an important example of how decades of careful evidence preservation, combined with advances in science, can fundamentally reshape the outcome of a criminal investigation. One of the most enduring lessons from the case concerns the value of crime scene preservation. When investigators processed the evidence in December 1974, they had no practical method of extracting the information that modern DNA analysis would eventually reveal. Nevertheless, they documented the crime scene thoroughly, collected biological material, preserved physical exhibits, photographed relevant evidence, and maintained investigative records according to the professional standards of their time. Those decisions proved critical. Evidence cannot be recreated decades later. If it is lost, contaminated, or improperly documented during the original investigation, future scientific advances may have nothing left to examine. The Walker case is therefore frequently cited during law enforcement training as an illustration of why every item collected at a crime scene deserves careful handling, even when its immediate value is uncertain. Forensic science itself also changed dramatically between 1974 and the eventual prosecution. In the mid-1970s, criminal investigations relied heavily on witness testimony, fingerprints, blood typing, trace evidence, and traditional detective work. DNA profiling did not yet exist as an investigative tool. Laboratories simply lacked the scientific methods necessary to distinguish one person's genetic profile from another with the precision available today. By the late 20th century, DNA had transformed criminal investigations. Initially, scientists required relatively large biological samples to generate useful profiles. As laboratory technology improved, however, increasingly smaller and older samples became suitable for analysis. The Walker investigation benefited directly from these advances. Evidence collected decades earlier could finally be examined using methods unavailable to the original investigators. Experts often describe this progression as one of the defining developments in modern forensic science. Rather than replacing traditional investigation, DNA analysis expanded the range of questions investigators could answer objectively. It could confirm or exclude individuals. It could establish biological relationships. It could identify unknown contributors under appropriate circumstances. When combined with other evidence, it became one of the most powerful investigative tools available. The Carla Walker case also illustrates the importance of multidisciplinary cooperation. Modern homicide investigations frequently involve professionals from diverse fields. Detectives reconstruct historical events. The crime scene specialists preserve physical evidence. Laboratory scientists perform forensic analysis. Forensic genealogists identify potential investigative leads. Prosecutors evaluate legal sufficiency. Judges oversee courtroom proceedings. Jurors assess the evidence according to the law. Each discipline contributes distinct expertise. No single profession solves a complex cold case independently. Instead, progress results from collaboration across multiple specialties. Another important aspect of the Walker investigation involves forensic genetic genealogy itself. Since emerging as an investigative technique, forensic genetic genealogy has contributed to solving numerous violent crimes that had remained unresolved for decades. However, specialists consistently emphasize that it functions as an investigative lead rather than a substitute for forensic proof presented in court. In practical terms, genealogy narrows the search. Traditional investigation confirms or excludes individuals. Direct forensic DNA comparison provides the scientific evidence used during prosecution. Maintaining this distinction helps ensure both investigative accuracy and legal fairness. The public interest generated by the Walker case also reflected growing awareness of cold case investigations throughout the United States. For decades, many families assumed that unsolved crimes inevitably faded into forgotten archives. Modern developments have challenged that perception. Law enforcement agencies increasingly review historical investigations whenever advances in forensic science create realistic opportunities for renewed analysis. Nevertheless, investigators caution against unrealistic expectations. Many cold cases remain exceptionally difficult. Some lack biological evidence altogether. Others involve evidence that has deteriorated beyond scientific usefulness. Witnesses may no longer be available. Historical records may be incomplete. Every investigation presents unique circumstances. The success achieved in the Walker case depended upon an unusual combination of preserved evidence, scientific advancement, careful investigative work, and legal preparation accumulated over nearly 5 decades. For families affected by violent crime, the case also demonstrates the emotional complexity of delayed justice. A criminal conviction may answer long-standing legal questions, but it cannot restore the years that have passed. Parents grow older. Siblings build lives without those they lost. Friends remember birthdays, graduations, weddings, and family milestones that never occurred. Time changes the context surrounding a crime, but it does not erase its consequences. Many victim advocates note that families often experience renewed emotional strain when cold cases return to public attention. Old photographs reappear. Historical news reports are republished. Court proceedings require revisiting painful memories. At the same time, many families describe the opportunity to see evidence examined in court as an important part of the justice process. The Walker family publicly expressed gratitude to the investigators who continued pursuing the case across generations. Those expressions reflected recognition that the investigation depended upon the sustained efforts of many individuals over many years. The case likewise influenced conversations about evidence management within law enforcement agencies. Maintaining physical evidence for decades requires secure storage, careful documentation, and consistent administrative procedures. Police departments across the country have increasingly recognized the importance of preserving evidence in serious violent crimes for extended periods, particularly in cases involving unsolved homicides or sexual assaults. Improved evidence management systems, digital cataloging, and modern storage practices now help agencies maintain exhibits that may become valuable many years after collection. The Walker investigation demonstrates why those investments matter. Scientific capability often advances faster than anticipated. Evidence preserved today may answer questions tomorrow that investigators cannot yet ask. The investigation also highlights the continuing importance of historical records. Detective notes. Crime scene sketches. Laboratory reports, interview summaries, photographic documentation. Each became part of a comprehensive record that supported later investigators attempting to reconstruct events separated from them by decades. Accurate documentation allows future investigators to understand not only what evidence was collected, but also how decisions were made throughout the investigation. Without those records, later scientific findings become more difficult to interpret within their proper investigative context. For legal scholars, the Walker prosecution illustrates how courts evaluate evidence generated across multiple eras. Jurors were required to consider historical investigative records alongside modern forensic testimony. The legal process ensured that every witness could be questioned, every scientific method examined, and every evidentiary issue addressed according to established procedural safeguards. This approach reflects one of the central principles of the criminal justice system. Scientific advances strengthen investigations, but courtroom conclusions must always be tested through transparent legal procedures. Outside academic and legal discussions, the Walker case continues to hold significance within Fort Worth. The investigation remains part of the city's history, remembered not only because of the tragedy itself, but also because of the extraordinary span of time required to resolve it. Historical societies, local journalists, and community organizations have documented the case as an example of both the challenges and the persistence associated with long-term criminal investigations. For younger investigators entering law enforcement today, the case serves as a reminder that every report prepared, every photograph taken, every interview conducted, and every item of evidence preserved may eventually contribute to solving a crime long after the original investigators have retired. That perspective influences professional culture throughout modern policing. Investigators understand that their work often extends beyond their own careers. Each generation inherits responsibilities from those who came before. Each generation prepares the foundation for those who follow. The Carla Walker investigation demonstrates that continuity perhaps better than any single lesson could. It is a case in which evidence collected during one era, preserved through another, and analyzed using technologies developed decades later ultimately reached a courtroom where a jury fulfilled its constitutional role. The investigation's legacy therefore extends beyond one conviction. It represents the continuing evolution of forensic science, the enduring importance of careful investigative practice, and the commitment of successive generations of professionals who refuse to allow an unsolved homicide to disappear into history. By the time the Carla Walker investigation concluded in court, it had become more than the resolution of a single homicide. It had evolved into a case study examined by investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and criminal justice educators across the United States. Its significance lies not only in the identification and conviction of the offender, but also in what it demonstrates about the long-term relationship between evidence, technology, and perseverance. Cold case investigations often challenge a common misconception that if a crime is not solved quickly, it is unlikely ever to be solved. In reality, many investigations remain active for years or even decades, particularly when physical evidence has been preserved. Detectives assigned to cold case units routinely review historical files, compare them with new information, and reassess evidence whenever advances in forensic science create opportunities that did not previously exist. The Walker investigation followed that pattern. Although there were long periods without public developments, the case was never forgotten within the Fort Worth Police Department. Records were maintained. Evidence remained secured. Investigators periodically revisited the file as forensic capabilities improved. This continuity illustrates one of the defining characteristics of professional criminal investigations. Progress is not always visible. Sometimes it occurs quietly in evidence storage facilities, forensic laboratories, archives, and investigative review meetings, long before the public learns that a breakthrough has occurred. Another important lesson concerns the pace of scientific innovation. When Carla Walker was murdered in 1974, DNA profiling did not exist. When investigators revisited the case years later, DNA analysis had become a routine forensic tool. Later still, forensic genetic genealogy emerged as another investigative resource. Each generation of technology expanded the questions investigators could answer. Importantly, however, each new method depended upon evidence that had already been collected and preserved. Science cannot analyze evidence that no longer exists. For that reason, crime scene preservation remains one of the most fundamental responsibilities in criminal investigation. Experienced investigators frequently advise younger officers to collect and preserve evidence carefully even when its immediate value appears uncertain. Advances in laboratory science often reveal significance years later that could not have been anticipated during the original investigation. The Walker case provides a clear example of this principle. Evidence collected according to the standards of 1974 remains scientifically valuable decades later because it had been properly preserved. The investigation also demonstrates the importance of maintaining comprehensive records. Every interview, every laboratory submission, every evidence transfer, every supplemental report. Together, these documents created a detailed investigative history that later detectives could understand and verify. Unlike fictional portrayals of investigations, real criminal cases often involve extensive documentation. Accurate record-keeping allows future investigators to reconstruct decisions made years earlier and to evaluate evidence within its proper historical context. Forensic laboratories likewise depend upon detailed documentation to establish chain of custody and ensure that analytical results correspond to the correct evidence. Without reliable records, even scientifically valid laboratory findings may become more difficult to interpret or present in court. Education within forensic science has increasingly emphasized this connection between scientific analysis and investigative documentation. The Walker investigation illustrates that successful prosecutions depend upon both. Scientific findings require reliable historical context. Historical investigations benefit from scientific advances. Neither alone is sufficient. The case also provides insight into the evolution of forensic genealogy. Unlike direct DNA database comparisons, forensic genetic genealogy requires investigators to integrate scientific analysis with traditional historical research. Genealogists examine publicly available records, construct family relationships, and assist investigators in identifying individuals whose backgrounds warrant further investigation. This process is methodical rather than dramatic. It often requires months of careful research. Every genealogical conclusion must ultimately be verified through conventional investigative methods before it becomes relevant to a criminal case. The Walker investigation demonstrated how genealogy functions as one component of a broader investigative strategy rather than as a replacement for established forensic procedures. Legal professionals have also studied the case because it reflects the procedural safeguards applied when introducing modern scientific evidence in historical prosecutions. Cortes require expert witnesses to explain laboratory methods clearly. Defense attorneys have the opportunity to question those methods. Judges determine whether scientific testimony satisfies applicable legal standards before it is presented to juries. These procedures help ensure that new technologies are incorporated into criminal trials responsibly. The Walker prosecution proceeded within this established legal framework. Every stage from evidence preservation to DNA analysis, genealogy, and courtroom testimony was subject to judicial oversight. For victim advocates, the case represents another important aspect of long-term investigations. Families affected by violent crime often live through years of uncertainty before answers emerge. Even when arrests eventually occur, decades may have passed. Children become adults. Parents grow elderly. Immunities change. The emotional consequences of violent crime extend far beyond the initial investigation. Many advocates therefore emphasize the importance of communication between investigators and families throughout cold case reviews. Although investigative details cannot always be disclosed publicly, maintaining contact helps reassure families that their loved one's case continues to receive attention whenever new opportunities arise. The Walker family's experience reflects the extraordinary patience often required in such investigations. Nearly half a century separated the crime from the courtroom. That span encompassed enormous changes in society, policing, and forensic science. Yet the central objective remained unchanged throughout every stage of the investigation: determining responsibility based upon reliable evidence. The case has also influenced discussions surrounding evidence retention policies. Historically, storage limitations sometimes resulted in the destruction of older evidence after investigations concluded. Modern practices increasingly recognize that biological evidence associated with serious violent crimes may retain scientific value for many decades. Accordingly, many jurisdictions have revised evidence retention procedures to support future forensic analysis whenever possible. The Walker investigation illustrates why those policies matter. Evidence preserved across generations may ultimately provide answers that were scientifically impossible at the time of collection. Another notable feature of the case is the collaboration required between multiple institutions: local police investigators, state forensic laboratories, specialized forensic genealogists, district attorneys, judicial officers. Each contributed expertise within established professional standards. Complex investigations increasingly depend upon this collaborative approach, particularly when scientific analysis extends beyond traditional investigative techniques. The Walker case therefore reflects not only advances in forensic science, but also advances in institutional cooperation. Public interest in the investigation remained strong throughout the legal proceedings. Journalists covering the case frequently emphasized its broader implications rather than focusing solely on courtroom developments. Many reports highlighted how preserved evidence, modern laboratory methods, and persistent investigative work combined to resolve a crime committed decades earlier. This emphasis helped increase public understanding of cold case investigations and the practical realities of forensic science. Unlike fictional portrayals, real investigations rarely hinge upon sudden revelations. Instead, they develop through careful documentation, scientific validation, and patient investigative review. That distinction remains one of the most valuable educational lessons emerging from the Walker case. Today, law enforcement agencies continue reviewing unsolved homicides using similar principles. Cases involving preserved biological evidence receive renewed attention as laboratory methods continue advancing. Investigators remain aware that future scientific developments may create opportunities unavailable even today. The Walker investigation demonstrates that criminal investigations are not fixed in time. Evidence remains constant. Scientific understanding evolves. When those two elements meet under careful investigative practice, historical questions may finally receive reliable answers. The story of Carla Walker, therefore, continues to be discussed not because it represents an extraordinary exception, but because it illustrates what becomes possible when professional persistence spans generations. It reminds investigators that careful work performed today may become the foundation for tomorrow's discoveries. It reminds forensic scientists that every advancement expands the reach of justice. And it reminds the public that while time changes communities, technology, and institutions, carefully preserved evidence can continue speaking long after the events that created it have passed into history. As the legal proceedings concluded and the Carla Walker case entered the historical record, criminal justice professionals began reflecting on the broader implications of the investigation. Cases like this are often remembered for the moment an arrest is announced or a verdict is delivered. Yet those moments represent only the final stage of a process built upon thousands of smaller decisions made over many decades. One of the most important questions raised by the Walker investigation is why some cold cases become solvable while others remain unresolved. The answer is rarely simple. Every investigation begins with a unique combination of circumstances. Some crimes occur in locations where extensive physical evidence can be recovered. Others leave behind very little. Some cases involve eyewitnesses. Others do not. Some offenders leave biological evidence. Others leave almost none. The quality of the original investigation also matters. Proper documentation, accurate evidence collection, secure storage, detailed reports. These foundational practices determine whether future investigators will have meaningful material to examine as technology advances. The Walker investigation benefited from careful evidence preservation despite the scientific limitations of the 1970s. That fact alone does not guarantee a future solution, but without preserved evidence, later advances in DNA analysis would have had little practical value. Modern investigators frequently emphasize that preserving evidence is an investment in future possibilities. No detective can predict which scientific techniques will exist 20, 30, or 50 years later. Consequently, agencies increasingly approach serious violent crimes with long-term evidence management in mind. The Walker case is regularly referenced in discussions of this philosophy because it demonstrates how biological evidence retained across generations can eventually answer questions that once appeared impossible. Another lesson concerns the role of patience in criminal investigations. Public attention often focuses on rapid arrests and immediate results. In reality, many homicide investigations proceed gradually. Detectives revisit witness statements, review historical records, consult forensic specialists, compare evidence against new databases, reevaluate investigative theories. Each review may produce only incremental progress. Yet over time, these incremental advances can accumulate into significant breakthroughs. The Walker investigation reflects exactly that process. There was no single dramatic moment that solved the case. Instead, progress resulted from decades of consistent investigative efforts supported by scientific innovation. The investigation also illustrates the importance of institutional memory. Police departments experience continual personnel changes. Detectives retire, and supervisors change assignments. Laboratory staff move into new roles. Without comprehensive records and effective evidence management, knowledge accumulated during earlier investigations can gradually disappear. Maintaining continuity, therefore, becomes a professional responsibility. Historical case files preserve not only evidence but also investigative reasoning. They document why certain decisions were made, which leads were pursued, which theories were eliminated, and what remained unresolved. This information enables future investigators to continue rather than restart the investigative process. The Walker case demonstrates the value of that continuity. Successive generations of investigators inherited organized records that allowed them to build upon previous work rather than reconstruct it from memory. Another important aspect involves public confidence in forensic science. DNA evidence has become one of the most influential forms of forensic evidence presented in criminal courts. At the same time, experts consistently caution against viewing DNA as infallible or self-explanatory. Scientific evidence must be collected properly, analyzed according to validated laboratory procedures, interpreted within its investigative context, and presented accurately in court, subjected to cross-examination. Only through this complete process does forensic evidence become part of the legal determination of responsibility. The Walker prosecution followed these established principles. A DNA analysis was not considered in isolation. It formed one component of a broader evidentiary record that included investigative documentation, witness testimony, laboratory procedures, and judicial review. This comprehensive approach strengthens both scientific reliability and legal fairness. The investigation also illustrates how technological innovation influences criminal justice without replacing human judgment. Laboratory instruments generated DNA profiles. Genealogical databases identified possible relatives. Computers assisted in analyzing genetic information. Yet every significant investigative decision remained the responsibility of trained professionals. Detectives evaluated leads. Scientists interpreted laboratory results. Prosecutors assessed legal sufficiency. Judges ruled on evidentiary issues. Jurors determined the verdict. Technology provided new information. People remained responsible for interpreting and applying that information within established legal standards. Educational institutions increasingly use investigations like the Walker case when teaching future forensic scientists and investigators. As students examine the chronology of the investigation, the preservation of evidence, the development of DNA technology, the application of forensic genealogy, the courtroom presentation of scientific findings. These examples help illustrate how multiple disciplines interact during complex criminal investigations. The Walker case also highlights the importance of ethical responsibility within forensic science. Every laboratory analysis carries significant consequences. Forensic scientists therefore follow rigorous quality assurance procedures designed to ensure accuracy, reproducibility, and transparency. Independent review. Instrument calibration. Documentation requirements. Validation studies. These practices exist because scientific findings introduced in criminal trials must withstand careful scrutiny. The integrity of the justice system depends upon that reliability. Likewise, forensic genealogy has prompted ongoing discussions concerning privacy, transparency, and investigative oversight. Many professional organizations have developed ethical guidelines governing the appropriate use of genealogical databases in criminal investigations. These discussions continue as technology evolves. The Walker investigation is frequently included within those conversations because it illustrates both the investigative value and the importance of responsible implementation. For communities affected by long unsolved crimes, the case offers another perspective. Although decades passed before an arrest occurred, the investigation demonstrates that unresolved cases need not remain permanently inactive. Scientific advances continue creating opportunities for renewed analysis. Investigators continue reviewing historical evidence. Families continue receiving updates when meaningful progress occurs. While not every investigation can be solved, continued professional effort remains an important part of law enforcement's commitment to victims and communities. The Walker family often expressed appreciation for the investigators who persisted across generations. That appreciation reflects a broader truth about cold case investigations. Success rarely belongs to one detective or one laboratory. Instead, it reflects the cumulative work of many individuals performing specialized responsibilities over many years. Each contribution matters. Each report. Each evidence log. Each laboratory analysis. Each legal review. Together, they form the investigative record that ultimately reaches the courtroom. The lasting legacy of the Walker investigation therefore extends well beyond one criminal conviction. It reinforces professional standards emphasizing evidence preservation, scientific integrity, interdisciplinary cooperation, judicial fairness, institutional continuity, patient investigative work. These principles continue guiding homicide investigations throughout the United States today. Perhaps most importantly, the case reminds investigators that the passage of time does not necessarily diminish the value of evidence. Physical evidence does not become less truthful because decades have passed. Scientific understanding evolves. Analytical capabilities improve. Historical records gain new significance when examined through modern investigative methods. The Walker investigation stands as one example of that reality. Its resolution required nearly half a century. Its lessons continue informing criminal investigations well beyond Fort Worth. For investigators opening an unsolved case file today, the story offers both practical guidance and measured optimism. Evidence preserved carefully may one day answer questions that current technology cannot. Scientific progress may illuminate details previously hidden. Persistent investigative work may eventually connect information separated by decades. While no investigation can promise such an outcome, the Walker case demonstrates that careful professional practice keeps those possibilities alive. That enduring lesson remains one of the investigation's most significant contributions to modern criminal justice. Looking back across nearly 5 decades, the investigation into Carla Walker's murder provides a detailed record of how criminal investigations can evolve alongside scientific progress. It is a story that begins with the limitations of forensic science in 1974 and concludes in an era when technologies unimaginable to the original investigators became central to identifying the person responsible. For historians of criminal justice, the case marks an important transition between two distinct periods of investigative practice. In the 1970s, homicide investigations depended primarily on witness testimony, physical evidence, interviews, crime scene reconstruction, fingerprints, and traditional laboratory techniques. Detectives often relied upon persistence, experience, and community information to develop suspects. While these methods solved many cases, others remained unresolved because available scientific tools simply could not answer every question. The emergence of DNA profiling fundamentally altered that landscape. Beginning in the late 20th century, Biological evidence became capable of providing highly individualized information when suitable samples were available. Over time, laboratory methods became more sensitive, more reliable, and more widely accessible. The Walker investigation illustrates how evidence collected before the DNA era can gain entirely new significance once scientific capabilities advance. Importantly, however, scientific progress alone does not explain the outcome. The evidence had to survive. Records had to be preserved. Chain of custody had to remain intact. Detectives had to continue reviewing the case. Laboratories had to apply validated analytical methods. Prosecutors had to determine that sufficient admissible evidence existed. Only through the interaction of these factors could the investigation ultimately proceed to trial. This principle is emphasized repeatedly within forensic education. Scientific breakthroughs do not replace professional investigative practice. They depend upon it. Every properly labeled evidence package, every accurately completed laboratory submission, every documented interview, every preserved photograph. These routine professional responsibilities create the foundation upon which future scientific advances operate. The Walker case demonstrates that principle with exceptional clarity. Another aspect of the investigation concerns public understanding of cold case work. Popular media sometimes portrays cold case investigations as sudden breakthroughs produced by a single overlooked clue or unexpected confession. Actual investigations are generally much more methodical. Detectives review historical files, verify previous investigative steps, assess evidence using contemporary forensic standards, consult specialists, compare information from multiple sources, evaluate alternative explanations, document every finding carefully. Progress often occurs gradually rather than dramatically. The Walker investigation followed this realistic investigative pattern. Years of review preceded the eventual forensic breakthrough. Extensive verification followed the laboratory findings. The legal process required additional months of preparation before the evidence could be presented in court. The investigation therefore illustrates persistence rather than immediacy. Another important educational lesson involves the distinction between investigative certainty and legal proof. Investigators may develop strong suspicions during the course of an inquiry. However, criminal charges require evidence capable of satisfying legal standards established by the courts. Similarly, a scientific finding alone does not automatically determine guilt. Evidence must be presented through witnesses, subject to cross-examination, evaluated by the judge, considered by the jury alongside all other admissible evidence. These procedural safeguards remain essential regardless of whether a case involves recent events or crimes committed decades earlier. The Walker prosecution reflected these long-standing legal principles. Forensic scientists testified regarding laboratory procedures. Investigators explained how evidence had been collected and preserved. The defense exercised its right to challenge the prosecution's evidence. Jurors ultimately determined the facts based upon the evidence admitted during trial. The investigation also highlights the increasingly interdisciplinary nature of modern criminal justice. Complex investigations often require expertise extending beyond traditional policing. Forensic biology, molecular genetics, genealogy, digital records management, historical research, evidence preservation, trial advocacy. Each discipline contributes specialized knowledge while operating within established professional and ethical standards. The Walker investigation brought many of these disciplines together. That collaborative approach has become increasingly common in serious cold case investigations. The case further demonstrates the importance of continuous professional development within law enforcement and forensic science. Investigators who began their careers before DNA profiling became widely available have witnessed extraordinary technological change during their professional lifetimes. Likewise, laboratory scientists continually adapt to new analytical methods, quality assurance standards, and emerging technologies. Professional education enables investigators and scientists to incorporate these advances responsibly into ongoing investigations. Without that commitment to continued learning, many historical cases would remain beyond the reach of modern science. The Walker investigation therefore reflects not only technological innovation, but also the willingness of professionals to adapt their investigative practices as new knowledge becomes available. Beyond its scientific significance, the case also contributed to discussions surrounding victim-centered investigations. Modern policing increasingly recognizes that families affected by violent crime remain connected to investigations regardless of how much time has passed. Maintaining appropriate communication, explaining investigative developments when possible, and acknowledging the long-term impact of unresolved cases have become important components of professional practice. Although investigative confidentiality necessarily limits the information that can always be shared, many agencies emphasize transparency whenever doing so will not compromise the investigation. The Walker family's experience illustrates both the emotional difficulty of waiting decades for answers and the importance of sustained investigative commitment. Another practical lesson concerns evidence retention policies. As forensic capabilities continue expanding, agencies increasingly recognize the value of preserving evidence associated with serious violent crimes for extended periods. Improved environmental controls, digital evidence inventories, marketing systems, secure storage facilities. These administrative improvements may appear routine, yet they directly influence the ability of future investigators to conduct meaningful scientific analysis. The Walker investigation provides a compelling historical example of why such investments matter. The evidence collected in 1974 remained available because generations of professionals maintained responsibility for its preservation. The investigation has also influenced broader conversations about forensic accountability. Every scientific discipline requires rigorous standards, independent verification, peer review, documentation, validation, quality assurance. These principles protect both the integrity of scientific findings and the fairness of criminal proceedings. Forensic laboratories involved in criminal investigations operate within structured accreditation and quality management systems designed to ensure reliable analytical results. The Walker case demonstrates how these standards support judicial confidence in scientific evidence introduced during trial. For educators, the investigation offers a comprehensive example of the interaction between law, science, and investigative practice. Students studying criminal justice frequently examine the chronology of the case to understand how evidence collected under one generation of technology can eventually be interpreted using another. The case also illustrates how criminal investigations remain dynamic rather than static. Evidence does not change. Scientific interpretation evolves. Legal procedures adapt to incorporate new knowledge while preserving fundamental constitutional protections. This balance between innovation and legal continuity remains one of the defining characteristics of modern criminal justice. Today, investigators assigned to cold case units continue applying these lessons. Historical evidence is reviewed using contemporary methods. Laboratories reassess previously inconclusive samples. Investigators collaborate with specialists across multiple disciplines. Cases once considered unsolvable receive renewed attention whenever realistic opportunities emerge. Not every investigation will produce the outcome seen in the Walker case. Many challenges remain. Evidence may be unavailable. Witnesses may no longer be living. Scientific limitations continue to exist. Nevertheless, the Walker investigation demonstrates what becomes possible when careful evidence preservation, scientific advancement, and sustained professional commitment converge over time. Its legacy extends beyond one courtroom or one community. It has become part of the broader history of forensic science and criminal investigation, reminding future generations that the pursuit of justice often depends as much upon patience and preparation as it does upon technological innovation. The case continues to serve as a valuable educational example precisely because it reflects real investigative practice measured, methodical, evidence-based, and grounded in the principle that every conclusion must ultimately be supported by verifiable facts. The resolution of the Carla Walker investigation also offers an opportunity to examine how cold cases influence the development of modern policing. While individual investigations are unique, many of the practices now considered standard in homicide investigations have been shaped by lessons learned from cases that remained unsolved for years or even decades. One of the clearest examples is the increased emphasis on preserving evidence for the long term. In earlier decades, evidence retention policies varied significantly among jurisdictions. Storage capacity, administrative practices, and available resources often influenced how long physical evidence was maintained. As DNA technology demonstrated its extraordinary investigative value, many law enforcement agencies reassessed these policies. Today, biological evidence connected to serious violent crimes is frequently preserved for extended periods, recognizing that future scientific developments may reveal information that current technology cannot. The Walker investigation illustrates why this approach is so important. The biological material collected in 1974 retained evidentiary value because it had been carefully preserved through decades of scientific change. Had that evidence been discarded, damaged, or improperly documented, the opportunity for later forensic analysis would likely have been lost. This lesson extends beyond homicide investigations. Sexual assault investigations, unidentified human remains cases, and missing person investigations all rely heavily on careful evidence preservation. Improvements in forensic biology continue expanding the range of information that can be recovered from older evidence, making long-term preservation increasingly valuable. Another important lesson concerns documentation. Experienced investigators often emphasize a simple principle: write reports as though another detective may need them decades later. The Carla Walker case demonstrates the wisdom of that advice. Original reports prepared in the 1970s became essential historical records during the renewed investigation. Detective notes, witness interviews, evidence inventories, crime scene diagrams, laboratory requests, each contributed to a comprehensive understanding of the case. Accurate documentation allows future investigators to reconstruct not only what occurred, but also how previous investigators evaluated available information. This continuity reduces unnecessary duplication of effort and supports informed decision-making when cases are reopened. The investigation also reflects the increasing role of specialized cold case units. Many police agencies now maintain detectives whose primary responsibility is reviewing unresolved homicides and other serious violent crimes. These units combine historical investigative experience with access to modern forensic techniques. Their work often involves identifying cases most likely to benefit from renewed scientific analysis, reviewing preserved evidence, consulting forensic laboratories, re-examining witness statements, searching newly available databases, coordinating with prosecutors. The Walker investigation exemplifies this systematic approach. Rather than relying upon chance, investigators applied structured review processes designed to identify realistic opportunities for progress. The case also highlights the importance of collaboration between law enforcement and forensic laboratories. Modern forensic investigations depend upon clear communication regarding evidence condition, analytical priorities, and laboratory capabilities. Scientists require sufficient contextual information to understand investigative questions. Investigators require accurate explanations of scientific findings and their limitations. This exchange ensures that forensic results are interpreted appropriately within the broader investigative context. The Walker investigation demonstrates how effective collaboration can strengthen both scientific analysis and investigative decision-making. Another significant aspect involves public education. High-profile cold case investigations often generate considerable media attention. While public interest can increase awareness of forensic science, it can also create misconceptions if investigations are portrayed as relying solely upon dramatic technological breakthroughs. In reality, scientific advances operate within a framework of careful investigative practice. Evidence must first exist. It must be preserved. It must be analyzed using validated methods. Results must be interpreted responsibly. Legal standards must be satisfied. The Walker case provides an opportunity to explain this process accurately. Its resolution resulted from decades of cumulative professional effort rather than any single discovery. The investigation likewise illustrates the importance of maintaining professional objectivity. Detectives assigned to long unsolved cases often recognize the emotional significance these investigations hold for victims' families and communities. At the same time, investigators remain responsible for evaluating evidence impartially. Scientific findings must be interpreted according to established standards. Alternative explanations must be considered. Investigative conclusions must be supported by objective evidence. This commitment to impartiality protects both investigative integrity and public confidence. The Walker investigation proceeded within these professional principles. Scientific analysis guided investigators toward new leads. Those leads were verified through additional investigation. Evidence was presented in court according to established legal procedures. The resulting conviction reflected the operation of the criminal justice system rather than investigative assumption alone. The case also contributed to broader discussions surrounding forensic innovation. Advances in molecular biology, genetics, and digital information management continue creating new investigative possibilities. Researchers are exploring improved methods for analyzing degraded DNA, identifying unknown individuals, and integrating multiple forms of forensic evidence. Each advancement offers potential benefits while also requiring careful validation before becoming part of routine investigative practice. The Walker investigation demonstrates how established scientific methods can be incorporated responsibly into historical criminal investigations. Educational institutions frequently reference the case when discussing evidence-based policing. Evidence-based policing emphasizes decision-making informed by research, validated practices, and objective analysis rather than anecdotal assumptions. The Walker investigation aligns closely with this philosophy. Investigators relied upon documented evidence, scientific validation, systematic review, interdisciplinary collaboration, legal oversight. Each stage reflected structured professional practice supported by measurable evidence. Beyond the professional community, the case continues to hold significance for the public. It reminds communities that the criminal justice system is capable of adapting as scientific understanding evolves. While no investigative process can guarantee success in every case, the willingness to revisit historical evidence demonstrates an ongoing commitment to pursuing unanswered questions whenever meaningful opportunities arise. The Walker investigation also illustrates the value of institutional resilience. Police departments change over time. Leadership changes. Personnel retire. Technology evolves. And budgets fluctuate. Yet effective institutions preserve knowledge across these transitions. Evidence management systems. Archived investigative files. Professional training. Administrative continuity. These elements enable investigations to continue despite the passage of many years. The Walker case represents a successful example of that continuity. Perhaps one of the most enduring lessons concerns professional responsibility. Every investigator entering a crime scene today contributes not only to the immediate investigation, but also to the possibility of future scientific analysis. Every forensic scientist conducting laboratory examinations contributes to a record that may later be reviewed in court. Every prosecutor preparing evidence contributes to the integrity of future legal proceedings. Every participant in the criminal justice process influences outcomes that may extend far beyond the present moment. The Walker investigation demonstrates how these individual responsibilities accumulate over time. No single report solved the case. No single laboratory test resolved every question. No single investigator carried the investigation from beginning to end. Instead, the resolution emerged through sustained professional commitment shared across generations. For that reason, the case remains an important educational example within criminal justice. It illustrates how careful investigative practice, scientific advancement, legal procedure, and institutional continuity interact over decades to address one of the most difficult challenges in policing, resolving violent crimes long after they first occurred. Its legacy continues influencing investigators who approach today's crime scenes with an understanding that the evidence they preserve may still be speaking many years into the future, even if science has not yet learned how to hear every part of its story. The Carla Walker investigation continues to be discussed because it illustrates a broader truth about criminal investigations. Justice is not measured solely by speed. While prompt investigations remain essential, the history of forensic science demonstrates that some questions cannot be answered until technology advances. In those situations, The responsibility of investigators is not to predict the future, but to preserve the possibility that future generations may succeed where current methods cannot. That perspective has become increasingly important in modern police.